Well, welcome everybody to Unlocking Daniel. We are happy that you are joining us this week. We have a exciting, maybe a little bit of an intense study today. We're gonna have to go pretty fast in order to accomplish what I'm hoping we can accomplish. So we'll see how far we get. But we'll start with a word of prayer, and then I want to answer one question from last time, and then we're going to dive in and take a look at the little horn in Daniel chapter 7. So Renee, would you pray for us as we begin?
Dear Heavenly Father, we're glad to meet again together through computers. It's a wonderful method and to be able to draw us together even though we may be many miles apart. We pray that your Spirit again will come, be with us, to interpret the words, to help us have understanding of the words in the book of Daniel, Daniel 7, the pivotal chapter in this book. Thank you for hearing and answering this prayer. In thy name, amen.
Amen. All right. So as we begin here, I just want to take a minute and last week, I think it might have been Lori, I can't remember who, somebody had asked a question about the dates. And we had assigned a date of, an ending date of 30 BC for the kingdom of Greece, which was after the beginning date for the kingdom of Rome. And so Lori was just asking about that, and last week at that time I said, oh, that's a typo. It's not the right date. Anyway, I correct myself for my correction. It actually is the right date. So you might remember that when we talked about the kingdom of Greece, Alexander died. He didn't have a successor, and his kingdom was split apart into these four parts. And those four parts, four kingdoms, really started what was called the Hellenistic era. And that era continued well after the rise of Rome. So sometimes people give 168 and the Battle of Pydna as the end of the Greco-Macedonian Empire, which was true in a sense, but the Hellenistic kingdoms, the Greek kingdoms, continued all the way up until 30 BC. And you might remember the story of Cleopatra and that whole very interesting portion of history, but the final of those four kingdoms, those Hellenistic kingdoms, the Ptolemaic kingdom, came to an end in 30 BC with the death of Cleopatra. And that's when they were kind of really moved out of the way. But Rome was already full in swing before that time. So there's really an overlap between the beginning of Rome and the end of those Greek Hellenistic kingdoms. So that's the difference there. So I just wanted to set that straight. So tonight we're going to dive into Daniel 7, and we're going to do a bit of a review here, and then we will spend most of our time focusing on this little horn of Daniel chapter 7, which is a new character, a new part of the prophecy that we haven't talked about. And the chapter actually spends quite a bit of time on this little horn entity. But before we do that, I want to just do a bit of a review, and then we can talk about the little horn. So you might remember that in Daniel 7, the vision that Daniel has in chapter 7 starts with this vision of the four winds stirring up the great sea. And we said that for Daniel, from his perspective, the Great Sea was the Mediterranean Sea. So this was the sea that he would have thought of as the Great Sea. And these four beasts come up out of the Great Sea. And the reason that we're talking about this area, this part of the world, is because this is where God's people are. The little black star you see on the screen there, that is where Jerusalem is. And so this Mediterranean basin, Jerusalem is right there as part of that. And we'll see that these kingdoms all successively are occupying and ruling over this portion of the world. So we talked about 4 kingdoms here in Daniel 7, represented by 4 animals. The first, the lion, represented Babylon, this kind of king of the beasts, comparative to the head of gold in Daniel chapter 2. And remember, this lion has wings, and then its heart is changed to the heart of a man. It's made to stand on its feet like a man. So it becomes less beastly, and it becomes more human-like. And we talked about how that's exactly what happens to Nebuchadnezzar. He's made to eat grass like a beast because he's acting beastly, but then his sanity is restored to him. He becomes more human-like, and that's what happens here to this lion. The second creature representing a kingdom in Daniel 7 is this bear. It's got 3 ribs in its mouth, and it's leaning over on one side. And we talked about how if you see a person who's leaning on one side, well, you know something's wrong, right? They've got one side that's strong, one side that's weak. Their gait is not even. And so this bear, he's leaning to one side because there's this alliance between the Medes and the Persians. And although the Medes are older and used to be in power, they're now the junior partner, and it's really the Persians who are in the driver's seat over the Medes. The third animal was this leopard with 4 wings. We talked about how it was the kingdom of Greece that conquered the Persians. And just as a leopard is swifter than a bear, this leopard with 4 wings would be very, very quick. And of course, Alexander the Great was known for the speed which he conquered, carving out this huge empire in just a very short period of time. In fact, dying as a young man while he's still in the prime of his life. Of course, this leopard has 4 heads because Alexander's empire was divided into 4 parts when he died. He didn't have a son whom he could leave the kingdom to, so he says on his deathbed, the kingdom goes to the strongest, and there's this war that goes on for years between these different parts of the empire. Finally, the 4th beast, this dragon-like beast with iron teeth and horns, represents the kingdom of Rome that conquered the Greco-Macedonian and the Hellenistic kingdoms, and it ruled a greater area. You can see it rules the entire Mediterranean basin, Europe and North Africa, as well as the Middle East. And it does so for quite a long period of time, from 168, the Battle of Pydna, all the way to 476 when Rome is sacked. So there's this long period of time, 600 years or so, where it is ruling. So quite the impressive empire from a power and military perspective.
I want you to know that I slept well
You slept
last week after hearing this terrible dream where these animals get worse and worse and worse and worse.
You had sweet dreams.
I did, because the ending, you know, where Christ comes and saves them.
Amen.
So, saves
Amen.
us. So, yeah, I was pretty worked up.
Well, that's the beautiful thing about the vision, isn't it? So we have all these beasts, these animals, but then it transitions from these beasts that are ruling, you know, this parts of the earth. He sees this vision of the Son of Man in heaven, and this Son of Man is the one whose kingdom is going to be eternal and reign forever and ever. And last week we looked at the passages in the Gospels where Jesus, you know, this is the title he uses to refer to himself over and over and over again, the Son of Man. And even at his trial he said, you're going to see the Son of Man coming on the clouds, just like Daniel prophesied. So it's a beautiful ending to kind of a beastly story. So before we start moving forward with Daniel 7, any questions or comments about what we have covered so far in Daniel chapter 7? All right, I'm not seeing any questions. That means I've got the green light to move ahead. So we're going to, as usual, we will just take a very quick look at the structure of Daniel, remind us where we are at. Remember, Daniel is divided really into two halves, a Aramaic portion, chapters 2 through 7, and a Hebrew portion, chapters 8 through 12. The Aramaic portion forms this chiasm with this mirror pattern. The Hebrew portion also forms this mirror pattern. And so chapter 7 is the end of the Aramaic portion. And remember, chapter 7 is mirroring or paralleling chapter 2. And that means that chapter 2 is going to be a vital key in understanding chapter 7. We're going to see that the prophecies in Daniel are going to get harder and harder to understand. They're going to be more complex. The symbols are going to get even more obscure. And so we want to build on what has been revealed to us previously. So chapter 2 is going to be very important in us understanding chapter 7. I also just want to point out that chapter 8 and chapter 11 are also kingdom prophecies. So here in chapter 2 and chapter 7, chapters 8 and chapter 11, we have these prophecies of the kingdom, of the kingdoms and God's eternal reign. And we see this both in the Aramaic portion and in the Hebrew portion, which means that if we want to understand chapter 7, the chapters that are going to be the most helpful for us, first and foremost, are chapter 2, but then also chapters 8 and chapters 11 are going to be the chapters that are parallel in the structure of Daniel and will help us. I want to just mention one thing here. If you notice, chapters 7 and 8, they both use very similar imagery. So in chapter 7, you have these beasts or these animals. Chapter 8, you have beasts and animals. And then you have a little horn. So chapter 7, you have beasts, followed by this little horn that rules. Chapter 8, you have these animals, followed by this little horn that rules. And so that connection, I think, is one of the reasons why Daniel structured the book the way he did, so that chapter 7 and chapter 8 would be right next to each other. So chapter 8 is going to also be very helpful in understanding chapter 7. Let me say one more thing on the structure before we dive into chapter 7. Of these kingdom prophecies, chapter 2, chapter 7, chapter 8, and chapter 11, they get successively harder to understand. Chapter 2 is probably my favorite. It's the easiest to understand. It's very clear, very straightforward. Chapter 7 is more complex. It's more difficult to understand. Chapter 8 is even more difficult. We'll see chapter 11 is very difficult to understand. Something to keep in mind. These chapters are going to repeat themes. They're going to repeat ideas, but they're going to also add new things. As we're progressing through Daniel, we want to just build off of what we know, what we've already learned. So as we're studying chapter 7, we want to go back and study what we've learned in chapter 2 and use what we know as we go deeper into Daniel, because it is going to get harder. So that's not, I'm not saying that to scare you. I'm saying that to say if you're starting to feel a little lost, it will be helpful to go back and review. And what we've learned before is really going to lay the foundation for us as we get further and further into the book of Daniel. Okay.
So there's more details to keep track of as you progress along.
Yes. In fact, that's actually a perfect segue into the next thing I want to talk about is as we look at Daniel and these chapters, we'll see that the chapters, they repeat the same ideas, but it's almost like they're zooming in and they're magnifying or expanding or focusing more on certain parts. And as you zoom in, some parts might get left out around the edges, but you might see other parts more in detail. And let me just give you a very quick example of that here in Daniel chapter 2, chapter 7, and chapter 8. So what you're looking at on your screen is a chart showing the similarities between Daniel chapter 2, Daniel chapter 7, and Daniel chapter 8. These are 3 of the 4 chapters that are kingdom prophecies, prophecies about kingdoms and ultimately about God's reign. I didn't include chapter 11 here because 11 does get more complicated, and I just wanted to simplify it for now. But notice in 2, we've seen these symbols: a head of gold, arms of silver, belly of bronze, legs of iron, feet of iron and clay. Those kingdoms are destroyed by a stone that's cut out without hands. And then finally, there's a stone kingdom, which is representing God's eternal kingdom. In chapter 7, you have 4 kingdoms. Now, not represented by metals, but represented by animals. You have a lion with wings, a bear on its side, a leopard with 4 heads, a beast with iron teeth. Of course, the beast with iron teeth represents the same kingdom as the legs of iron, the kingdom of Rome. And then just as the legs of iron divided into feet of iron and clay, in chapter 7 you have this division. You have these 10 kings or 10 horns that come out of the dragon. So there's this, if you imagine a kingdom, one kingdom being split into 10 parts. It's being divided up. It's being fragmented. So this is corresponding to the feet of iron and clay, the divisions of the legs of iron in chapter 2. And then, just as we have the kingdoms are being destroyed in chapter 2, so in chapter 7 we have a court that is seated and the dominion is taken away from these beastly kingdoms. And then ultimately the chapter ends with the Most High and His kingdom reigning and the saints being given the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So we have the same conclusion as Daniel chapter 2. Notice in chapter 8, this time we have some of the same details, but it's now starting to leave out certain things so it can focus more attention. So instead of 4 beasts, we have 2, a ram and a goat. And then you also have this little horn, just like we had in chapter 7. We have the little horn being broken or judged. And chapter 8 is really going to focus on those 2 aspects. It's like it's zooming in on that part of the prophecy, on the little horn and the judgment of the little horn. So we're in chapter 7, we're introducing these characters. We kind of get a bigger picture. And then in chapter 8, we're going to zoom in on those characters more. And as we zoom in on those characters, we're going to leave out some of the details that we've seen in chapter 7 and chapter 2. So that's just kind of an overview of how the chapters connect and where we are going. Let me pause and catch my breath and see if anybody has any questions or comments so far. All right, this is your chance. I'm going to move ahead. All right, so we are now then going to... Okay, I think that's Wayne. Yeah, Wayne, please, what's your question?
So, who is ruling in chapter 8?
Who is ruling in chapter 8? You mean which kingdoms are ruling?
Yeah.
So, in chapter 8, it's very interesting because we are told in verses 20 and 21 that the ram and the goat represent the... Oh, let me repeat your question, actually, for those who are joining online. So Wayne's question is, who is ruling in chapter 8? And the answer to that is that in verses 20 and 21 of chapter 8, it tells us that the ram and the goat represent the kingdoms of the Medes and the Persians and the kingdom of Greece. But then we have this transition to this little horn power. And the rest of chapter 8 is going to spend quite a bit of time on this little horn, just like we saw in chapter 7. And actually the majority of the focus is not going to be on Greece and the Medes and Persians, but on this little horn power. So, if you want to know who that little horn is, well, that's what we're going to start talking about today, and it's going to actually probably take us 2 or 3 times to get all the way through it. So that's as far as I'll go on that question. Good question, Wayne. Any other questions before we start looking at this little horn in chapter 7?
It's really a good teaching method, isn't it? To start out simple and then build on and build on. So God is a good teacher.
Yeah, and he's repeating things and then he's adding a little bit more each time. And by having those earlier chapters that are easier to understand, the symbols are pretty straightforward. It really gives you a foundation and confidence as we go forward. So, okay, so Daniel chapter 7. We are going to start looking at this little horn figure. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at 8 identifying characteristics of this little horn in order to be able to understand who this little horn is. So we're going to focus in on verses 8, verses 20, 24, verses 25. And what we'll do as we go through these verses, as we read them, we're going to make a list of how the little horn is described. And then once we have this list, it's kind of like, if the police are looking for a suspect, they might start giving characteristics. Oh, they've got brown hair, they're about 5 feet 10 inches tall, they've got a tattoo. Well, if you just took one of those characteristics and said, okay, well, you've got brown hair, you must be the criminal or the suspect, it's not going to work.
It's dangerous.
Yeah, you've got to take the whole list, and that's going to narrow down the field. And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to compile a list, and then we're going to use that list to compare the different ideas for the identity of this little horn, and then we'll see what fits. So,
a historical treasure hunt.
A historical treasure hunt. Yeah, I like the way you put that. We're gonna go on a historical treasure hunt. It's gonna be a lot of fun, and the chapter gives a lot of attention to this little horn figure. This, for some reason, the identity of this figure is important to God. It's devoting a lot of space here in the chapter, and so it's important for us to understand this. And of course, understanding this part of chapter 7 will be crucial as we go forward. All right, so Daniel 7, let us start with verses 7 and 8. Daniel 7, verses 7 and 8. This should be on page 864 if you're using one of the Bibles that we have supplied. And Renee, if you'll read those verses for us.
After this I saw in the night visions, and behold, a fourth beast, dreadful and terrible, exceedingly strong. It had huge iron teeth. It was devouring, breaking in pieces, and trampling the residue with its feet. It was different from all the beasts that were before it, and it had 10 horns. I was considering the horns, and there was another horn, a little one, coming up from among them, before whom 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots. And there, in this horn, were eyes like the eyes of a man, and a mouth speaking pompous words.
Okay, very good. So let's jump down now to verses 19 all the way through 25. So in Daniel 7, we have the initial vision, and we've just read the description of the little horn in the initial vision. And then an angel comes to Daniel and starts giving an interpretation.
Good.
And so, which is very good. We're very thankful for that. And so we're going to read in verses 19 to 25 what the angel has to say to Daniel about this little horn figure as he is explaining some of the dream.
19 and 25?
19 through 25.
Okay. Then I wished to know the truth about the fourth beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And then the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely, that horn which had eyes and a mouth, which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints and prevailing against them until the Ancient of Days came, and a judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Then he said, The fourth beast shall be a fourth kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue the 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a times, and half a time.
Okay, thank you. Very good. So, now that we've kind of read the important verses, we're going to start working our way through these and seeing if we can compile a list of 8 characteristics that will help us to identify this little horn power. So, you'll notice that I'm going to break these characteristics up into 2 parts, 4 and 4. And as we go along, I think you'll see what the distinction between the first 4 and the second 4 are. So, the very first thing that we can notice about this little horn is where it comes from. So, this little horn is said to come up from among the 10 horns. Now, this is very important, and this is probably maybe the most important identifying characteristic, but it's the most basic one. So remember, you have these 4 beasts in Daniel 7, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome, that beast with iron teeth, representing the kingdom of Rome that crushes and devours all the others. And then out of that 4th beast, that dragon-like beast, there's these 10 horns. And in, let's see, verse 24, it tells us, the 10 horns are 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom. So the kingdom of Rome is going to be divided up. And we know from history that's exactly what happens. So Rome is so vast. We looked at the map earlier. They're Europe, the Middle East, all of North Africa. As I've mentioned before, at its height, 1/3 of the world's population lived within the borders of the Roman Empire. It's this vast expanse of an empire, and it's too big. They can't hold it together, and these Germanic tribes and others start to rebel and fight against Rome, and it splinters into pieces. The date is typically given as 476, but it was really this longer process that began even before that and continued after that of the Roman Empire just being splintered up into these fragments. So, these 10 horns represent these fragments of the empire, just as the toes on the statue of Daniel 2 represented the fragments, the feet of iron and clay. So we have this breaking up, and it's from among the fragments, among the 10 horns, that the little horn arises. Now this is really important for us to understand. The little horn power of Daniel 7 arises from the fragments of the Roman Empire, which means we can't be talking about, China or some other place. And I've seen so many different interpretations, like Prince Charles is the
Oh, really?
he's the little horn from Daniel 7, or just crazy stuff. Everything you ever want to see is there on the internet. But we know that we're talking about a power that comes from among the fragments of the Roman Empire, comes from among the 10. Okay.
And it subdues 3 kings.
Yes.
So that is another significant hint.
Yes.
Or clue.
So very good, very good. So yes, we know that it not only comes up from among the 10, but as it does so, it's going to subdue 3 of the horns. And I think, in fact, the word it uses in one place is uproot, right? Verse 8, 3 of the first horns were plucked out by the roots.
Whoa.
So it's
That's pretty good. That takes care of them.
sounds painful. I've never had a horn growing on my body, but if I did and it was plucked out by the roots, I'm sure it would hurt. So this horn not only comes up among the fragments of the Roman Empire, among the 10 horns, but it's going to make room for itself.
So that it doesn't come back.
Yeah,
it's by the roots.
It's removing 3 of the other horns, subduing them. So 3 of the other horns are somehow moved out of the way in order to make room for this little horn. All right. Does this make sense so far? Any questions, comments so far? Okay, so let's keep going here. We are told that this horn will be different from the rest of the 10 horns. So if you look with me in verse 24, the 10 horns are 10 kings which shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and shall subdue 3 kings. So somehow this little horn is different. Now it doesn't tell us how it's different.
Well, it does have eyes.
It has eyes.
And a mouth.
It has eyes and a mouth. Yeah, that's...
But you must be thinking of something else.
Well, yeah, I guess you're thinking about just the way it physically looks. We're not told that any of the other horns have eyes and mouths. So that's very true. It's different in that way. It's got these eyes of a man. It's got this mouth. We're going to find out about the mouth, what it does here in just a little bit. But yeah, it's different somehow. And we're told, remember when we read about the 4th beast, it said that it was different from the other kingdoms.
Oh yes, it did say that.
And we saw that the Roman Empire was more powerful. It conquered a bigger area. It lasted for a longer time. It was different in its strength. And somehow this little horn is going to be different. There's going to be something that sets it apart from the other horns, the other fragments of the Roman Empire. Okay, so let us keep going here. So we are not only told that it's going to be different, but it also says that it's going to be greater than his fellows. So if you look at verse 20 of Daniel 7, it says, the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. So this horn, if you look at it, it's going to be greater, stronger, more powerful, larger. It's going to be greater than the other horns. It's greater than its fellow horns. Okay, so if you'll notice that the first 4 characteristics that we've looked at so far, that we've seen here in Daniel chapter 7, verse 8, verse 20, and 24, all of these first 4 characteristics are about how this little horn relates to the other horns, right? It comes among the 10, it subdues 3, it's different from the others, it's greater than the others. So these first 4 characteristics are all about how the little horn is different or relates to the other horns that it comes up among. Now we're going to see that the last 4 characteristics of the little horn are going to all be about how this little horn relates to God and his people. So the first 4 are about how the little horn relates to the other kingdoms, the other horns that it comes up among, the fragments, these fragments of the Roman Empire. The last 4 are going to be about how the little horn relates to God and his people. So
horizontal,
yeah,
and vertical.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, horizontal. How's it dealing with the you could say the political world, the kingdoms around it, and now we're going to look at this vertical dimension, the spiritual dimension, in many ways. So yeah, we've looked at the horizontal. Now we're going to go to the vertical. Okay, so chapter 25 is kind of the gold mine for all these vertical components, although you can find snippets of them in other verses, such as verse 8 and verse 20, that we've already seen. So Daniel 7, verse 25, he shall speak pompous words against the Most High, shall persecute the saints of the Most High, shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for a time and times and half a time. Okay, so we're going to see here 4 characteristics of this little horn, how it relates to God and his people. The very first is that he's going to speak pompous words against the Most High. So, pomp, you think about pomp and pompous, there's this pride, this arrogance, this self-exaltation, but he's not just exalting himself. These are words against the Most High. So he is exalting himself in relation to God. And you might think of Lucifer.
Yes, exactly. That's what I was going to say.
When we looked at
Isaiah 14.
Isaiah 14, exactly.
Ezekiel 28.
When we looked at the story of Nebuchadnezzar,
yes,
and his pride,
yes,
and his exaltation, we also looked at how that was connected to this exaltation of Lucifer. I will be like the Most High. And I don't think it's an accident that that's the way that Daniel 7 refers to God. That's the way that Daniel 4 referred to God. That Nebuchadnezzar was exalting himself against the Most High. Daniel 7, this little horn is exalting himself against the Most High. And that very name is a reminder that they aren't, right?
Yes.
They are not the Most High. But he is exalting himself against the Most High. So these are pompous words. We would call this blasphemy.
Yes.
Blasphemy is something that is speaking against God. And I think this is really the epitome of blasphemy, when you are exalting yourself over and against God. In fact, when we get to chapter 8, maybe we'll be able to tie in a little bit more with Revelation 13. We'll do a little bit of that here tonight. But that's the word that Revelation 13 uses to describe what I believe is the same power. It says it speaks words of blasphemy. So these are pompous words, but they're not just proud words. Oh, I'm better, I'm stronger, I'm richer. These are proud words, pompous words against God, blasphemous words.
So is this religious? Is this power religious? If it's exalting itself above God?
So it is certainly operating in the religious realm, right? There is this spiritual, it's not just fighting against other kingdoms.
Yes, it's taking on the God of
heaven. He seems to be fighting it against God. And we see that here in verse 25 and other places in Daniel 7. We'll see that in chapter 8 with its description of the little horn, that this power is really not just fighting against other powers on the earth, but it's really, there's this spiritual component. It's fighting against God, and in chapter 8 it'll say, the prince exalts himself against the prince of the host. So he's there's the spiritual warfare, I guess you could say, going on. Okay, so it speaks pompous words against the Most High. Notice it also makes war against the saints. So it says that he shall persecute the saints of the Most High. And if you notice your footnote there, literally it says wear out the saints. And this is the same sort of language, the same sort of wording here in the Aramaic that you'd use like for wearing out a garment. Like, you just think about a garment that's being used and rubbed and worked, and it eventually just, starts to break down. So this persecution of the saints, this wearing out of the saints, it's not just something that happens quickly. This is a long period of time that the saints are being worn out. They're enduring, they're persecuting. And in fact, that's going to be a key question for chapter 8, where the question will be asked, how long? How long can this go on? In fact, Revelation will pick up that same refrain. How long, O Lord? So the saints are being persecuted for a period of time, not just for an instant or a moment. So it's going to persecute the saints, the followers, the believers. Literally, it means the holy ones of the Most High. So he's fighting against God, but he's also fighting against God's people.
Wow.
Okay, let me pause here for just a moment. Questions, comments so far. We've covered about 6 of the 8 identifying characteristics. Questions, comments so far? Hopefully you guys are seeing this from the text, that I'm not just pulling these out of thin air, that these are all right from here in Daniel 7. Okay, well, let's go back.
These texts are getting more intense.
Yes, they are very intense, very, very intense. All right, so the 7th characteristic, we see this here in Daniel 7:25, is that he's going to think to change times and law.
Wow.
Now, this is very interesting how this is worded, because I think in the King James it says intends to change times and law. It doesn't say he actually accomplishes it, right? This is what he's got in his mind. This is his purpose, his goal, is to change times and law. Now remember, we're talking not about the horizontal component, as Renee put it, but about the vertical component. So whose times and law are we talking about? This would be God's time and law, right? And that makes sense, because if this was talking about times and law, human laws, human times and calendars and things, I mean, those change all the time, constantly. Congress is, passing laws and
Daylight
rescinding
savings
laws.
times.
And yes, daylight savings times is on the docket, apparently. And that's not a big deal. It's not noteworthy when human laws are changed.
But, even in these times with Daniel earlier, when the king made a decree about someone praying to anyone but the king, he couldn't change the law.
Yeah, that's interesting.
He had made, and the same happened with Nebuchadnezzar and the what do you call it? The idol or the image. Once they said something, it was
they
law.
They didn't like to back down. And the Medes and Persians were actually famous for this, that law couldn't be revoked. You might remember the same things in the book of Esther. The law of the Medes and Persians can't be rescinded. That was kind of a part of their culture and their governance. And yet, we have this little horn power that's trying to change, apparently not human law, but God's law somehow.
The fact that he thinks he can change laws, that's quite a statement.
Yeah, and it doesn't say he accomplishes it. It just says this is what he's planning to do. This is what he is thinking to do. He's going to try to somehow change times and law.
So he's going after God, he's going after his people, and he's going after the government of God.
Yeah, God's ways, God's laws. Exactly. So you can just kind of see this chain, how he's fighting against God's kingdom from all its different angles. Fighting against the king, fighting against his subjects and the kings and the laws of the land, in many ways, the laws of God's kingdom.
What's left?
Yeah, that's about it. That's about it. So it's going to speak pompous words against the Most High, make war against the saints of the Most High, think to change times and law. And now we'll look at the 8th characteristic here in verse 25. It says, the saints will be given into his hand, meaning he's going to be able to persecute, get them, have some sort of dominion or power over them for a time, times, and half a time. For a time, times, and half a time. So this is a time period. It says this is how long the saints are going to be given into his hand. Now, we're going to have to slow down a little bit here, and I put this one last intentionally of the characteristics because this one isn't as straightforward as the others. What does it mean that the saints are going to be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. How do we understand this? So what I want to do is try to help you understand the wording here, the way that these Aramaic words are being used, and help us to make this a little bit more concrete. Okay, so the word for time that is used here is the word idon. It's an Aramaic word, and it could be used to mean time in general, but what it literally means is a year. So what you have here on the screen is just a copy and paste from Strong's Exhaustive Concordance, but you could look at something like Thayer's or Brown's Driver and Briggs, and they'll give you a very similar definition that this word literally means a year. So it can mean a time in general. Like maybe an example would be when we tell somebody, oh, give me a minute or give me a second. Well,
that's prophetic time, isn't it?
We don't really mean a minute or a second. You know, we're kind of using that as a stand-in for time in general. So this literally means a year, but sometimes it can just be used as, like, we might say like a season or a minute, or, you know, it's just kind of using it as a stand-in for time in general. Okay, so, but the way this is worded is very specific here in Daniel 7. And in fact, we're going to see that chapter 12 is going to pick up this wording again, and then Revelation is going to pick up this wording. So we need to understand, what does it mean when it says a time, times, and half a time? So we're going to walk through this. If I'm going too fast, just holler at me and we'll slow down. But what does it mean when it says time, times, and half a time? Okay, so if we just take this step by step, literally a time equals a year. So one time, which is how it starts, a time was equal to a year. Now you'll notice I put a year on your screen equals 360 days.
Okay.
Now before you like close out your Zoom window and say he doesn't even know how to count how many days are in a year, I do know how many days are in a year, 365, but we will see that the years that are used here in Daniel 7:25 have 360 days. Now, you probably going to have to trust me for like 4 minutes, and then I'll back it up a little bit. I'm going to show you some verses from Revelation and some other places that make this very clear that this time period, each of these years, has 360 days. What we do know from the ancient world is that many of the ancients there was all sorts of different calendars, but there was a idealized calendar based on the stars that the Babylonians used, and that idealized calendar based on the stars had 360 days. Now remember, the Babylonians were famous for their astrologers. They were big on the movement of the stars and the stars predicting things. And they had a normal calendar that didn't have 360 days. In fact, well, it gets really complicated, but it wasn't 365.25 like we have. There's this, they had to add extra months and things to get to where we do the year we have today. But they had a theoretical calendar that wasn't in use except by the wise men, the sages, the prophets, people like Daniel, who would have been trained in the courts. And this was based on the stars. And part of the reason that they loved the idea of a year, ideally having 360 days, is because the Babylonians used a sexagesimal system, meaning a math system that was based on the number 6. Now, in our culture, in our modern world, we use our math system is base 10, meaning we group things by tens, hundreds, thousands, that sort of thing. But their math system was base 6, which is why in the radius of a circle, there are 360 degrees, 60 times 6, which is why in an hour there are 60 minutes, in a minute there are 60 seconds. All of this is because of the Babylonian system of math, which is a sexagesimal system base 6. And so they love the idea of having a year with exactly 360 days. It was very idealized. Daniel would have been very aware of this as he was trained in the wisdom of the Babylonians. Now, I can show you that from a biblical perspective. I'm going to share with you a little bit of the historical perspective. I'll show you the biblical perspective, but you'll have to wait. You'll have to wait 3 or 4 minutes before we can get there. Okay, so 1 year of 360 days. A time represents 1 year of 360 days. Times. Now, literally in the Aramaic, the word times, it's plural, but it's a special sort of plural. In English, we just have singular and plural could be 2 or it could be 2 billion. Well, in Aramaic, there is a dual ending, and the word times is a dual word, meaning literally what it says is a time and 2 times. A year and 2 years. So 1 year has 360 days. 2 years, excuse me, would have 720 days. All right, so we have a time, 1 year, 2 times, times, 2 years, and then half a time. So if a year is 360 days, half a year,
It's 180.
180. All right. So all of this, if we add it up, comes out to 1,260 days. A time, 2 times, and half a time. 360 plus 720 plus 180 comes out to 1,260 days. Now this number, 1,260, is going to be an important number. We will see this number, this idea, in a few different places. We'll see it again in Daniel in chapter 12, but we'll see this pop up about 5 or 6 times in the book of Revelation. And the book of Revelation is going to focus on this time period, but it's going to use different ways to describe the same time period. So I promised that I would show you that a 360-day year was the right way to understand this. Let me try to do that now by looking at some additional verses with you. Okay, so there are several places in Daniel, but also in Revelation, where it uses the same language we just read in Daniel 7:25. Time, times, and half a time. So we can see that in Daniel 7:25, in Daniel 12:7. We can also see it in Revelation 12:14. But there are also several places in Revelation that describe a period of 42 months. We can see this in Revelation chapter 11, verse 2, and 13, verse 5. So you think about a year, 2 years, and half a year, 3.5 years. Well, how many months are in 3.5 years?
42.
42. You didn't even have to add it, right? The Bible did it for you.
Yes.
12 months in a year, so you've got 3 years would be 36, plus another half a year, another 6 months is 42. So Revelation also describes this time period as 42 months. And then Revelation describes this period of time as 1,260 days. 1,260 days. And all of these same, all this language, these 3 different ways of describing this time period are being used to describe the same time period. Now, let me show you what I mean. Let's go together to the book of Revelation and we'll see how this same time period is described. And then hopefully you'll believe me that a year has 360 days. All right, go to Revelation chapter 12 and verse 6.
That's on page 1182.
All right, Revelation 12 and verse 6. And Renee, if you'd read that for us.
Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days.
Okay. So this woman, we're not going to get into all the symbols here, but just there's this woman who's fleeing, and I believe she's fleeing persecution. We'll see that later on. So remember in Daniel 7:25, the saints are persecuted for this time period, and here we see this. The time period is described as 1,260 days. Now go down with me to verse 14. And let us read Revelation 12, verse 14.
But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle, that she might fly into the wilderness to her place, where she's nourished for times and a half a time from the presence of the serpent.
Okay, so notice we've got the same thing going on here. In verse 6, this woman is fleeing into the wilderness to a place prepared by God, that he's going to take care of her for 1,260 days. In verse 14, she's given wings to fly into the wilderness, where she is nourished for a times and half a time. So it should be very clear from these verses that prophetically speaking, times and half a time is equal to 1,260 days. So those 3.5 years are these kind of idealized prophetic years of 360 days each. So does that make sense? Maybe we should give a little bit of time for questions. I know that was maybe new to some of you. Does it make sense? Any questions about this time period in Daniel 7:25 that a times and half a time is 1,260 days.
And these are talking about the same time period.
They're talking about the same time period. We don't have time to make all the links, but you can see how Revelation is clearly using the language.
Yes.
There's no other book in the Bible other than Daniel that uses that phrase, times and half a time. And so when Revelation is using that phrase from Daniel, it's using it very intentionally.
They're talking about the same thing.
They're talking about the same thing. And in fact, Revelation, of course, uses a lot of Daniel's imagery. Any questions about this times and half a time? You guys with me?
They're a good class.
All right. So we have 8 characteristics. Comes out of the 10 horns, subdues 3 kings. He's different from the rest of the 10 horns. He's greater than his fellows. Speaks pompous words against the Most High. Makes war against the saints. Thinks to change times and laws. And the saints are given into his hand for a times and half a time, a period of 1,260 days. Now, we'll talk about that period of time later on. My view is that those days are symbolic, and I'll explain what that means. Not tonight, hopefully next week if we have time. But this is a summary of these 8 characteristics. So now we've got a list of characteristics. And now we can begin comparing this list to see if we can find a power or an entity that matches up these characteristics. And again, we're not looking for something that matches 4 or 5 or 6. We're trying to find something that matches all 8 of these 8 descriptions of the little horn. Okay, so let me go to one other thing that I think will help us before we start talking about possible interpretations of the little horn and possible people or powers that could match these 8 characteristics. I want you just to look very quickly with me at the little horn, the descriptions of the little horn in Daniel 7 and the descriptions of the little horn in Daniel 8. And we'll see that the descriptions are very similar, and I believe that the little horn in Daniel 7 is the same as the little horn in Daniel 8. Now, I know we're kind of getting a little technical, we're getting a little nerdy, you might say, tonight, but I think that if you kind of stick with this, this will pay dividends in the end, in not only understanding Daniel, but also in understanding the message and the meaning behind these symbols. So stick with me, and I think it'll pay off. So Daniel 7 and Daniel 8, we have both of these powers are called a little horn. So there's horns in both chapters, other horns, but specifically there's this focus on this little horn power. In chapter 7, the little horn is said to be greater than his fellows. In chapter 8, he grows exceedingly great. In chapter 8, you have the ram, which represents the Medes and Persians, which is said to be great. And then the goat, which represents Greece, is very great. And then the little horn is exceedingly great. So you go from great to very great to exceedingly great. So there's this description of greatness of this little horn power. In Daniel 7, he speaks pompous words against the Most High. In Daniel 8, he exalts himself. As high as the Prince of the Host. So again, he's not just exalting himself, but against God, against the Prince of the Host. In Daniel 7, he persecutes the saints. In Daniel 8, he tramples the host, and he destroys the holy people. And literally, that's what the word saint means, is the holy ones, or the holy people. So again, persecuting, exalting against God, and fighting against God's people. In Daniel 7, we have a heavenly court that convenes and takes away the dominion of the little horn. In Daniel 8, we have the little horn is broken, but not by human hands.
We've heard that phrase before.
Yes.
Not by human hands.
You know exactly. That's exactly right. So you might remember that in Daniel chapter 2, we have these kingdoms. And there, at the feet of iron and clay, it's struck by a stone. And Daniel 2 says that stone was cut out without human hands. So it's the judgment of God against these kingdoms. And here in Daniel 8, we see again the judgment of God against this little horn power. He's broken, but not by humans. He's broken by the power of God. And of course, that is a parallel to the heavenly court that convenes in Daniel 7. This isn't a human courtroom. We're told, there's chariots of fire, there's books, there's 10,000 times 10,000, there's the Son of Man, the Ancient of Days. This isn't a human courtroom. This is a heavenly courtroom that is judging this little horn and bringing it to an end. So we see very, very clearly that these two little horns in 7 and 8, they're really the same. They're the same characteristics are describing them. So what we learned for the little horn in chapter 7 will carry over to the little horn in chapter 8. All right. Questions, comments, thoughts so far? I see people taking notes. Nobody's sleeping. At least I can't tell. So hopefully we're good to go.
So when this little horn is in power, it's down in the statue that's down in the feet and toes where the clay and the iron are mixed, and that's where this little horn is.
So yeah, if you look at chapter 7 and compare it to chapter 2, the fourth beast of chapter 7 parallels the legs of iron in chapter 2, and then after the fourth beast are the 10 horns, and you've got after the legs of iron in chapter 2, the feet of iron and clay, and it's among them among these 10 horns, the division of the Roman Empire, where this little horn comes to power. So that's where we should be focused on in history to try to understand this little horn power. Okay, so my enemy, the clock, is ticking furiously. We're gonna see how far we get, and we might not finish this evening, but we'll just keep going, and we'll stop when we need to.
Reed,
Yes.
there's a question.
Oh, okay, great. Will you read that question for us? Okay.
And it says, Marcia is asking, who is the host that gets trampled?
Ah, that's a very, very good question. So we'll have to expand on that when we study chapter 8. But the question Marcia asked is, who is the host that gets trampled in Daniel chapter 8? The little horn tramples on the host. Well, you can think of the host two ways. So we're told that he exalts himself against the prince of the host. And the prince of the host, that seems to be a divine title. You think about the heavenly host, so the angels there. In fact, Revelation 12 has a similar sort of idea where this dragon is taking the stars and hurling them to earth. But there's also this idea that it's not just heavenly beings that are getting trampled upon, but God's people. That those who are the saints, the believers in God, are trampled upon. So this trampling, we'll get into this a little more, and my explanation is probably a little too brief to make too much sense now, but basically there's a heavenly component to this trampling where there's an assault upon those in the heavenly realm, but then there's an assault upon those who are followers of God, followers of the Prince of the Host, here in the earthly realm.
And Revelation 12 alluded to that when it talked about the woman. When she goes into the wilderness and she's protected by God. The two texts that we read there.
Yeah. So
God's protecting her from being trampled on.
Yeah. So we'll dig into that a little more when we get to Daniel 8. But there's kind of two components to this trampling. Good question. Very good question. So what I would like to very quickly discuss is that in the book of Daniel, and really in the book of Revelation, there are basically three schools of thought to understand the symbols of Daniel. Now, many of the symbols are explained, and so when we're told that the ram is the kings of Media and Persia, well, everybody agrees. There's no argument there. But the symbols that aren't explained, the symbols that we have to interpret, there's basically three schools of thought: preterism, historicism, and futurism. And I need to just kind of explain these schools of thought to you and let you know my perspective, where I'm coming from, as we continue to move forward. So preterism is basically the idea, it comes from I think it's a Latin word, praeter, meaning like history or what is past. And basically it's the idea that the symbols of Daniel and the symbols of Revelation have all been fulfilled in the past. So this is looking behind us in history and saying all of the symbols of Daniel and Revelation have been fulfilled in the past tense. Now, there's a little bit of wiggle room here. Some maybe conservative preterists would say what has been fulfilled in the past is going to kind of repeat itself again in the future. But the basic idea is that the symbols of Daniel are pointing towards something that has happened already in the past tense in the past. Futurism is kind of the other side of that. It's saying that the symbols of Daniel and Revelation are really pointing toward an end-time apocalyptic event or a series of events that are happening in the future from us, from our perspective. So preterism is in the past, futurism is in the future, and historicism lies really in the middle of those two. So historicism is the idea that the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation, well, yes, some of that, the things prophesied have been fulfilled in the past, there's also a part of the prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled in the future. And historicism sees that the prophecies began to be fulfilled in the time of the prophet, but they stretch all the way down to the end of Earth's history. Mm-hmm. So, for instance, the historical view in Daniel 7 would say that, yes, Daniel 7, we can see it starting in the time of Daniel with the lion being overcome by the bear representing the Medes and the Persians, but that prophecy will stretch all the way down to the end of time and find its ultimate fulfillment at the end of the world and the second coming. So historicism is kind of in the middle between the two. Now, most critical scholars today, those are typically in the preterist camp. And that is largely because they don't believe in predictive prophecy, meaning that
really?
These were not prophesied ahead of time, but they were recorded afterwards. So Daniel's writing more as a historian than he is as a prophet. And so that's why they'll date, for instance, the writing of the book of Daniel to 164 BC because they think it predicts the rise of somebody by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes, and there's a pointing toward, Daniel is just kind of recording what has happened in the past. Most other scholars today, future would be more the futurists, those who believe in prophecy. Maybe more conservative scholars would be futurists. And there's only a minority of us in the historicist position.
Really?
Used to be a majority, but over the last couple hundred years, there are fewer and fewer historicists today. The primary understanding of the little horn in Daniel chapter 7 is that, of most scholars today, is that the little horn of Daniel chapter 7 represents the guy you can see on the screen here on this coin, somebody by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes. This is Antiochus Epiphanes, who ruled about 150 years or so, 180 years, 90 years before Jesus. And they believe that the little horn of Daniel 7 and little horn of Daniel 8 is fulfilled or about Antiochus Epiphanes. Now, we're pretty much out of time tonight, so we're going to have to wait, I think, till next week to go through this. But what we're going to do is we're going to go through the 8 identified characteristics that we've looked at from Daniel 7 of this little horn power, and we're going to see if this guy by the name of Antiochus Epiphanes really does meet these characteristics. Now, Antiochus was a Seleucid king. He was one of the kings of after the breakup of Alexander's empire into the 4 parts. He did some bad things. He went to the temple in Jerusalem. He installed an image of Zeus, the Greek god Zeus, sacrificed pigs to him.
Pigs in a Jewish temple.
Yeah, sacrificed pigs to a pagan god in a Jewish temple.
That's not good.
He persecuted Jews, killing many of them, forbade them from keeping Jewish laws, such as the Sabbath and other things. And all around was not a nice guy, did a lot of bad things, and the Jews, of course, saw him as an existential threat to their religion and to their way of life. So many scholars, in fact, a majority of scholars, see him as the fulfillment. Maybe fulfillment is not really the right word that they would use. He is the individual symbolized by Daniel 7. They wouldn't say fulfillment because they would say Daniel was written after Antiochus did these things. So we're going to take a look next time and see whether Antiochus fits these 8 characteristics, and then we'll go on from there. So if you have some time between next week, I encourage you to do some reading about Antiochus and familiarize yourself with some of the history if you can. Many people haven't even heard of him before, so you might want to do a little reading up on him.
He has something to do with Hanukkah, doesn't he?
Yes, so the rededication of the temple, that's the story of Hanukkah. And if you are familiar with the story of Hanukkah, it's after Antiochus had done this to the temple, the Jews are able to retake the temple, and then that story of the rededication of the temple is the story of Hanukkah and the lights in the temple. So yeah, that's exactly it.
So this little horn, it must be significant.
It is very significant.
More so than Alexander the Great or whatever, because the Bible is spending a lot of time on it, and it's also talked about in Revelation. So this little horn, it may be little, but it's very powerful and significant to you and me.
Yeah, it certainly, and I think we can see that this little horn is not just political. It's not just a kingdom that reigned and brought, human culture and language. It's spiritual, and there's a spiritual momentum and legacy that carries on from this little horn. And that's why Revelation keys in to the language and the imagery of this little horn power. And we see it over and over again in Revelation 12, Revelation 13, 16, 17. There's so much of the imagery and the language from Daniel 7 and Daniel 8 of this little horn power used there in Revelation. So it is a big deal. And that's why we're spending so much time on this.
So you're laying a sure foundation for the identity of this
I
little
hope so.
horn.
I hope so. That's my intention.
Yeah.
So in the last few minutes that we have here, let me just kind of close off with just how this is relevant not only to us today, but also to Daniel and his people. Remember that the main problem of the book of Daniel was that the unfaithfulness of God's people has caused them to be exiled from their kingdom and caused wicked kingdoms to rule over them. And here we're going to see that what is prophesied is not just a political kingdom ruling over them, but a kingdom that is going to persecute them spiritually. And God is warning his people that this spiritual persecution is coming, and that Daniel, even though you think it's bad right now, your people are carried into Babylon, there's this spiritual persecution of those who are intending to be faithful to God. They will have an enemy to contend with, those who want to be faithful. He's going to fight against not only God, but against God's people. But the promise at the end of Daniel is that this Son of Man is going to come and set things right. So Daniel 7 verses 26 and 27, but the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, meaning this little horn, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. So chapter 7 ends with this good news of, yes, there's going to be persecution. The saints are going to be worn out like a garment. God's going to be blasphemed. His law, there's going to be trying to be changes, all these bad things. But the Son of Man is going to preside over the court. We saw that earlier in Daniel 7. God's kingdom is going to be set up. And not only is God's kingdom going to be set up, but this is the first time in Daniel that we're told the kingdom is not only going to be set up, but it's going to be given to the saints. They are going to be given this kingdom of God. They're going to inherit the kingdom. And in fact, Jesus uses this language in the Sermon on the Mount. The meek shall inherit the earth. Not the pompous, proud, blasphemous little horn, not these kingdoms, but the meek, those who are like the Son of Man, those who are like Jesus, are going to be the ones who are going to inherit the kingdom and inherit the earth. So God is going to set things right, and He's not only going to establish His kingdom, but He's going to finally give a kingdom to the saints that will endure, that won't ever be taken from them, that will last for all of eternity. So that's the direction we're headed.
So Nebuchadnezzar was interested in the horizontal, other nations. He wanted to be more powerful. But this horn, you're saying, is different. It's not looking for a horizontal kingdom. It wants to usurp the vertical kingdom. And that's pretty serious for a Jew or for a Christian or anyone.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that here in chapter 7, we'll see it definitely in chapter 8, that the primary intention is that vertical component, that its primary target, the one it's fighting against, is against God.
Yes, and that's different. That is different than the other kingdoms.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, friends, that is the what we have time for this evening. Actually, let me put up our... Actually, you know what? Never mind. Because we didn't get all the way through Antiochus Epiphanes, the reading for next time, I'm going to hold off. You'll notice on the schedule that it says there's a handout. I'm going to hold off on that handout. So just read chapter 7. I see a question or a comment by Bev. Do you have a question or a comment, Bev? Oh, okay. I thought your hand was up. Okay. No problem. So reread chapter 7. If you have some time, study up on Antiochus Epiphanes. And the handout that was scheduled for next week, we'll delay it back a week and make sure that we take our time and go through this at a pace that we can all absorb everything. So Renee, would you pray for us as we close here?
Dear God in heaven, it is so reassuring to me personally that whoever is in charge here on this earth is in your hands. We are in your hands. Whether they try to take down the kingdom or your people or your laws, you have boundaries. You put boundaries 1,260 years on this particular power. That is very comforting to me to know that you are in charge of this earth. Yes, Satan, he has control here too. He's caused us each to sin. Help us to look at our lives and rid ourselves of whatever comes between you and us, because we want to be one of those saints that you're watching over and caring for and giving victory to. Please guide and direct each one this week as they study your word and become closer to you. In thy precious name, amen.
Amen. Thank you, everybody. We will look forward to seeing you next week. We will do chapter 7, part 3. Take a look at Antiochus, and we'll keep moving forward. Have a good night. God bless each of you. Thanks for joining us.
See you next week.